Welcome to week 11. In my opinion, this week is one of the most important weeks of the course. This week, our course materials will focus on ethics and social work research. Presently, before social workers can conduct research that involve human subjects, we are expected to uphold rigorous ethical standards. However, in the past, social science research hasn't always been humane. Many of the studies that I will describe will likely be a review for you, but personally, I am humbled when I reread these atrocities and pledge to never forget all of the research studies who unwittingly sacrificed their bodies for past researchers' wayward ways. Let's start with the Tuskegee syphilis study, which started in 1932 in Alabama. In this study, researchers diagnosed hundreds of African American sharecroppers with syphilis, but they didn't tell them of their known diagnosis. Rather, they told them that they had bad blood. The researchers weren't interested in treating the diagnosis, they were only interested in studying the progression of the disease, even after a known and effective treatment was discovered, i.e. penicillin. The researchers intentionally did not inform them about the treatment, and even further, they were kept from seeking treatment in the community. Fake treatments such as spinal taps were provided. Furthermore, 13 journal articles were published using this study. But it wasn't until Peter Buxton from the U.S. Army, who was trained as a social worker, went to the press and exposed the study to the public in 1972. Several years later, the men and their partners and their children who had syphilis congenitally were treated with antibiotics. Then there were, of course, the Nazi medical experiments during World War II, whose agenda was to advance German medicine without the consent of the patients, and with total disregard for the patient's suffering or even survival. Some of these experiments had legitimate scientific purposes, and others were racial in nature, designed to advance Nazi racist theories. After the war, on October 25, 1946, at Nuremberg, 23 men were tried for their crimes. 7 were sentenced to death, 9 to long prison terms, and 7 were acquitted. Of course, there were many physicians who had disappeared to other countries. More important, however, than the judgment were the principles articulated by the court. They form the foundation for contemporary medical practice and define what was wrong with the Nazi practice. The judges found that certain basic principles must be observed in order to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal concepts. These 10 principles form the Nuremberg Code. Please check out the resource in this week's course materials to read more. Not long after, on U.S. soil and also locally, in 1951, there was a Baltimore woman named Henrietta Lacks who went into Johns Hopkins for a medical procedure, and her cells were harvested and mass reproduced because they were a unique, fast-growing cancer that medical communities wanted to study. In fact, there was a book published recently in 2011 called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which details personal circumstances about the injustice that her and generations of her family have endured. These cells became known as HeLa cells, appropriating Miss Lacks' name and stripping away the humanity in her identity. So slides 9 through 12 bring up another local tragedy in Baltimore affecting study participants who live in homes with lead paint. From 1993 to 1999, this study tested low-cost lead abatement procedures to see how effective they were at reducing blood lead levels in children living in homes where these low-cost methods were implemented. All study participants were African American residents in East and West Baltimore. Furthermore, after the lead repair work was completed, researchers collected blood, dust, and water samples to test for lead for 2 years, yet never recommended that families move if blood lead levels were not improving. Families were placed in less contaminated homes than where they had lived before, but contaminated nonetheless. In 2001, the Maryland Court of Appeals lashed out at Johns Hopkins and Kennedy Krieger Institute for purposely enlisting healthy children to live in potentially dangerous homes. Lawsuits are still pending. Okay, so we've talked about many of the social research injustices of the past and somewhat present. Now I want to focus on what we're doing to respond to such unethical research experiments. Currently, any research within a university or hospital that involves human subjects and wishes to receive federal research support must establish an institutional review board, otherwise known as an IRB. This board is comprised of a panel of faculty and non-faculty to review all research proposals involving human subjects and rule on their ethics. The purpose of this board is to protect participants' rights and interests and ensure that the risks that they face by participating are minimal and justified by the expected benefits of the research. Many universities have an IRB, even if studies do not have federal funding, as a sort of best practice for research projects. More often than not, IRBs may refuse to approve a study or may ask the researcher to revise their study design. If study procedures change throughout the implementation of the study, researchers must then notify their IRB of that change. The following are key ethical guidelines that IRB panelists consider when reviewing a proposal: voluntary participation and informed consent, no harm to the participants, anonymity and confidentiality, lack of deceptive techniques, analysis and reporting, weighing risks and benefits, the right to receive services versus responsibility to evaluate service effectiveness, taking into consideration the NASW Code of Ethics, IRB procedures and forms, and finally training requirements. Now, these are considerations when you submit for a full review. However, there are exceptions, otherwise known as expedited reviews, for studies that qualify for an exemption. For example, when you are analyzing secondary data, in other words, data that has been previously collected, sometimes using human subjects, but you are now looking at their data and will have no interaction with the original participants. On the other hand, there are additional federal regulations for members of vulnerable populations, such as pregnant women, prisoners, children and minors, cognitively impaired persons, and others. IRB reviews can take a long time, but they ensure a just process. So switching gears, for discussion post number 9, due November 15th, I want you to find an article that discusses ethical issues in social research. You might enter one of the following search terms, so research ethics, informed consent, or institutional review boards. Read an article that interests you and summarize its contents, including its ethical considerations. Provide the article's citation, and this post should be approximately 300 to 500 words. There is also no response post required. For homework next week, please read Chapter 6, Culturally Competent Research, in either your textbook or ebook. It's the same chapter for both versions. Please remember to post your EBP Part 2 presentation in 2 places. 1, in the discussion board so group members can respond to 2 of your posts, and 2, in the Assignments tab for grading. Group B's presentation is due on November 8th, and Group C's is due on November 15th. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.